Good afternoon, Bill.
Hello, Carla.
So nice to connect with you, and I'm 99% confident that we are streaming to people who are really super excited to be listening to this chit chat this afternoon, where we talk about all your great work in literacy development over the years. So what I'd like to do to begin with is to, I'm just going to change my view so everybody can see. There we go, the two of us. That's much better. So what I'm going to do is just begin by sharing your incredible bio. So Professor Tunmer, who this afternoon we're going to be referring to as Bill, with your permission, received his PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Texas at Austin in 1979, specializing in the areas of theoretical linguistics, psycholinguistics, and cognitive development. From 1980 to 1988, Bill served on the staff of the Faculty of Education at the University of Western Australia, and from 1988 to early 2016 held the position of Professor of Educational Psychology at Massey University here in New Zealand, where he served as the Dean of the Faculty of Education. Professor Tunmer has published over 150 journal articles, book chapters, and books on early literacy development, literacy learning difficulties, and reading intervention. He has served on the editorial boards of Reading Research Quarterly, Language and Education, Reading and Writing, and the Journal of Learning Disabilities, and in 2012 completed a 5-year term as Associate Editor of Reading and Writing. And although supposedly retired, I feel like I really should be saying, Bill, semi-retired after the little chat that we've just had, because I understand that you still have a finger in the pie as such, and you are actually an adjunct professor working alongside some work with Canterbury and an advisory capacity with some of the early literacy work currently being undertaken with Canterbury University. It is an absolute privilege to be streaming you into our chit chat this afternoon, and my goodness me, you must feel incredibly proud of the influence that you have had on literacy education both nationally and internationally over the years.
Well, thank you very much, Carla, for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you and those out there who are listening or watching.
Absolutely. So, Bill, we were thinking that it would be really great for us to kick off our chit chat this afternoon with you sharing a little bit about perhaps your own personal history and sort of segueing into the development of the simple view of reading, and giving us a little bit of history as to where that view and perspective of reading and the simple view equation, I'm going to call it, if that's okay, actually came from.
Okay, I'm very happy to do that. As you are aware, the view was put forward, the first publication anyway, was 35 years ago. So that's going back and quite going back a long ways. So what I thought I'd do is to try to put the development into some kind of historical context. And in so doing, I thought I would even share a story about my own, something that happened to me as a child when I was learning to read, which also provides some of the historical context. You are probably aware of a famous book that was published in 1955 by Rudolf Flesch, Why Johnny Can't Read. And I was one of the Johnnies, actually, or at least for a while. Flesch was Austrian by birth, and he completed his doctorate of jurisprudence at the University of Vienna. Then he came to the United States and got a PhD at Columbia University in library science. And after that, he noticed, many of his colleagues and friends approached him about providing some tutoring for their children who were not learning to read. And actually this surprised Dr. Flesch, because most of these children were going to expensive private schools. So then why given they're getting the best, the most expensive education around. Why were they struggling? And he quickly came up with what he thought was the answer. And at that time, as he wrote in his book, there was an approach to reading that was very popular, sweeping the nation, and it was being used in many school districts as the new modern approach called look-say. You've probably heard of that. It's essentially the use of flashcards where children learn, well, phonics is totally out. Children learn to read by being taught to read whole word visual patterns, like, I guess, kind of like Chinese logographs. So also, the only other variable there was the frequency of occurrence of words. So they had print frequency accounts, or how often a word would appear in print. So those words might be taught first. So what that means is that there was no patterns, like the words weren't taught in word families. So there was even no chance that a child could learn to, or might be able to induce the pattern, the letter sound pattern from words like cat, fat, mat, sat. These are all pretty much random words. And so that was the approach. It was being pushed largely by colleges of education and certain professors of education. And as it happens, and I have to say a little bit about my age here, but I was born in 1947. And so I was attending first grade in, I guess, about 53. And I was taught by this method. And this was in California, San Francisco Bay Area, Hayward. And I didn't know it at the time, but I learned later that by the middle of the year, I couldn't read a word other than perhaps my name. And I found this out. My parents didn't know it, but sometimes this happens in life. Caught a lucky break. My father was transferred to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And there, this was after midpoint of the school year, after Christmas, I was enrolled in a local primary school, and they tested me and told my parents that, well, he's a non-reader. And they said, but no worries, we're familiar with children who have had the misfortune of being exposed to this method. So we have a teacher who's, she's a regular classroom teacher, but she's very good at dealing with this problem. And I, to this day, I haven't told the story to anybody, I don't think, to this day, remember her. It was Mrs. Anderson, and she's very strict. She used to walk around the class, the desks were arranged in a semicircle with a ruler in her hand. And sometimes when we were forming the letters or in a writing exercise, if we weren't doing it exactly the way she said, she'd slap that ruler down on the desk, making a noise that would certainly attract attention. But to cut a long story short, she taught reading, learning to read through traditional phonics. And by the end of the year, May, I guess, or maybe early June, I had caught up with my peers. And that was lucky for me. Now, after that, yeah, because I suppose I could have been, and then the next year, I fortunately had a good teacher, I remember her name, Mrs. Webner. She knew that I was a struggling reader in year one, and she introduced me some great books, children's literature. And I still remember this day that the first book, I don't remember what it was about, it was a story about an otter. And then she encouraged me to keep reading, and I developed a love for reading, and all the problems went away. So I was, I guess you could describe as one of the Johnnies and Why Johnny Can't Read, at least for half a year. And I suppose if I had stayed in California, I might have been diagnosed as reading disabled, perhaps as having dyslexia, who knows? But it was that difference. Now, that approach to reading, of course, became subject to, I mean, Flesch himself was not a researcher, but then this issue got picked up, of course, by a number of other people, and research started to be carried out, most notably by Jean Chall at Harvard. She then produced her famous book in 1967, The Great Debate, which was essentially at that time between this look-say approach and traditional phonics. Now, I should say right here, maybe later I'll talk about this, there are some issues about phonics, but at least those two, it's pretty clear that the evidence favored phonics instruction. Now, around the time that now we're moving to the simple view, when that was developed in the early 80s, there was quite a divergence between views in education and psychology. Education was largely followed the views of two, there were others, but two researchers. One was Ken Goodman, and an American, and then the other was Frank Smith, a Canadian. Ken Goodman wrote an article that was pretty influential in a lot of books following that, Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game. And Ken Smith wrote a book, Understanding Reading, a Psycholinguistic Analysis of Reading and how learning to read. And he drew on things like the signal detection theory that emerged from, I guess, the technology of radars and so forth during World War II. And his book, that book got republished and republished. It was regarded as the most popular book, Understanding Reading, for almost 2 decades in education. And the basic ideas were that we, those that are listening, and you and me, as adult skilled readers, we largely read by using the prior context to anticipate the word yet seen on the page, and then minimal word level information for confirmation. That's basically one of the key ideas. And of course, if that's true, it's definitely not. But if it were true, you would want to teach children essentially that way, to be good, use all these cues and then do that automatically. They argued against any phonics instruction. And then the other thing that was underpinning this approach was the idea, which grew out of, it was inspired by some of Noam Chomsky's work, but the research at the time, in the 60s, on language acquisition. And it was found that even though, well, largely the acquisition of language occurs naturally, in the sense that if you immerse a child in a rich verbal environment, and there's focus on meaning, of course, they largely acquire the language to which they're exposed fairly easily. And by the time they're 5 and 6, they have syntactic knowledge of the syntax of their language that would be the envy of second language learners. And of course, and they said this and everybody knew it, adults don't say to their child, well, today, Johnny, this is prior when they're 3 or 4, we're going to study the passive rule of English. I mean, the syntactic rules of spoken English are very complex, but they're not explicitly taught. So the idea that became popular was, well, why can't that happen with print? So if you immerse a child in a rich print environment, lots of exciting books and literature, and focus largely on meaning, then they will naturally acquire reading skills. And phonics is just a distraction. And also, and they were correct about this, people like Goodman and Smith, as adult skilled readers, when we see words that we know, we don't sound them out. We immediately recognize them. Now, what they didn't fully appreciate, which I talked about we'll talk about later, is the role that phonics plays in achieving accurate word recognition. But that was appealing. So those views became very, very dominant in education faculties. And so you could have on the same campus an education faculty and then a psychology faculty that was completely different. Now, I was invited to be an invited scholar at the Center for Cognitive Science at the University of Texas, and that comprised mainly cognitive psychologists, philosophers, logicians, computer scientists, and linguists. And the center was focused on advancing our understanding of human cognition. And that's when Phil Goff and I, who was also at the center, took on this task. Actually, it originated from an invitation from a guest editor of the journal Reading and Special Education, Isabel Lieberman, to make a contribution on reading problems. So that's how it came about. Now, in that context, we thought, well, we know what the model is that is being promoted by Goodman and Smith, and it's very popular in education practice. We wanted to develop a model that would provide a counter to that, but was also fairly simple in its structure, not in its components.
Can I just come in here, Bill, and say what you've said to us at this point in time? I just want to make a few links for teachers that are really relevant here, I think. So when you were referring to Goodman, you're talking about Ken Goodman,
Yes.
who was very, very instrumental with the development of reading recovery. And so what you've just explained to us is really the way...
Yeah, I wouldn't say he was responsible for the, but he had influence, I think.
Huge influence, absolutely. And so the research and the development that Goodman and Smith put out really formed the, I'm going to term it, ideology and many myths about how children learn to read that we are still currently working through today in 2021 in many, many classrooms across the globe. And so what we're saying is that, or what you're saying is that there was this body of research that was shared by those two researchers and predominantly based on their perspective that learning to read came through that look and say method, and they observed that children did not, what they believed to be was that skilled readers actually had the whole word there. But of course, we now know they didn't understand the process of orthographic mapping. They didn't understand that the word recognition skill component combined with that language comprehension came to where you're going to take us to with the simple view of reading. And so then you were invited to come in and give a different perspective that potentially came from a broader perspective of bringing in cognitive science into how do children become readers. And then you were tasked with, what is the simple view of reading? How do we bring that together?
A little bit more specific than that. There's a point I forgot to mention, but within the scientific community, it was known by, well, first of all, that view that Goodman and Smith came up with was called whole language. Don't break language up into bits with letter sound stuff. But we call it the constructivist. Constructivist in the sense children learn to read by reading. You don't need to teach them so much explicitly. Multiple cues view of reading. So that was the view that actually, as you mentioned, became popular in New Zealand, not just New Zealand, but all over the world.
Absolutely.
So, but within the scientific community, the theoretical underpinnings of that model, the Goodman stuff, the Smith stuff, interestingly, neither one of them, as far as I know, were psycholinguists, so they used that term in their, the term in the title of their famous papers. That was shown to be, was totally rejected by the scientific community by 1980. It wasn't a different perspective. It was just simply hard science that said, no, that's, I mean, it was testable, fortunately. Fortunately, it was at least had what it had going for him. You could investigate what they were saying. And one of the leaders in this area was a person named Keith Stanovich. He did a lot of research, but a lot of others. So it was pretty well known within the scientific community that those views were incorrect, both for skilled reading and for reading acquisition. It was known. So what we wanted to do in developing the model. Yes?
No, I was going to say, so in 1980, those in the scientific field recognized that constructivist approach to acquiring and the teaching and learning process of reading was not valid. That's what you've said, yeah?
Well, that could be somewhat overly simplistic. Yes, by and large, yes, but there's aspects of it that are
I'm
worth
just
considering.
picking that out, Bill, because you
Yes,
know, as you can
largely,
imagine, there'll be
particularly
lots of people
youth,
listening
yes.
who think, wow, my gosh,
Yeah.
that's like 32,
Yeah,
31
it
years
is.
ago.
Long time decades ago. But in terms of that first part, what we do, you and I and the listeners, skilled readers largely use prediction and context, and that, you know, in our skilled reading, and then therefore you need to teach children that way, was basically known very well by 1980, and probably a little bit before then. So that was the situation we were confronting, or that was the historical context for the development of the simple view. And that's one of the aims of having a model that focused, well, first of all, as a central component of that, we took language as essential, understanding spoken language, with the assumption, of course, that without knowledge of the language being read, reading couldn't take place, given that deriving meaning from prints, the goal that we all have in teaching children. So we then try to think of it as what is the child facing? And we argued that the fundamental task facing the child is to figure out how print, those funny little squiggles on the page, map onto their spoken language, the language that they bring. And if they could get into that system, maybe, the words, then they can use that system that they already have to get information from the individual words, then how they are combined, the syntax, apply their knowledge of language to get all the way to sets of interrelated propositions from which meaning emerges. So that was the idea, how that happens. And if you think of it that way, there are two ways the whole thing could break down. One is the language system that the child brings to the task of learning to read is underdeveloped or in various ways. And it's a complicated system, of course, but there could be aspects of it that would interfere with acquiring reading skill. Then the other major way is if the mapping between print to that language system is less than optimal in various ways. So those were the two immediate components. The ability, we argued that a child would then need those two components in order operating well, in order for reading acquisition to take place. And if to say it another way, if a child will basically have problems in reading or getting meaning from print if they can't recognize the words on the page quickly and accurately. Accurately is obviously important, but quickly too. And if they don't understand the language being read, then they're going to have problems. So that's in essence the model. We saw those two components, language and word recognition, as both equally important. So meaning, that's important. So that should satisfy some people in the whole language camp, but also each necessary. So if you think of it in formula terms, you could just say reading comprehension equals, well, we call it D then, but word recognition times language comprehension, a very simple formula. You need both. You can't read without a high level, reasonable level in each. So that was and that it's testable, of course. You can do that in regression analyses and so forth. And the early work on the model, it generated a lot of research over the years. And those two variables, just those two, accounted for most of, you could see it as a model of the proximal causes of individual differences in reading comprehension. So that at any given point in time, it can be older children, it can be adults, are a function of those two variables. And the reason the model is called the simple view of reading is that the structure is simple. We were quick to point out that understanding the components of language comprehension, for example, which is my background, is very complex. I've spent years studying that. And similarly with being able to learn to recognize words on the page, that's an extraordinarily underlying that is very complex. So that's not we're not saying that the reading is simple, and a lot of people took shots at us for suggesting maybe that, but that's not what we were trying to do. We were trying to get a simple structure, which then in turn, of course, provided a little framework for different types of reading difficulties. So you can have weaknesses in one or the other or both, and that kind of guided you in
Absolutely.
terms of deal with that. So that's that model.
So
And
when we think about where that model's gone from its early development and now leading into the cognitive foundations framework, and I was very grateful to receive that cognitive foundations framework reading from you, Bill, and we will post a link to our listeners to this piece of work, because I think that for those people who are intervention specialists across New Zealand, and also those people who teach beginning readers and or are really, really passionate about learning in more detail, the breakdown of the capacities that sit within language comprehension and the breakdown of capacities that sit within word recognition skills in more detail, and then the interplay of those it is so incredibly beneficial. I can say that myself from having read this wonderful piece of work that you've presented.
Oh, thank you.
What I really wanted to come to, though, just to talk about that cognitive foundations framework, because I think you've done such a great job of bringing it all together, Bill, and one of the biggest criticisms that we face when we're working in schools or trying to upskill teachers to understand the significance of both elements, being language comprehension and word recognition skills, is that sometimes people can misunderstand things and think that, you know, this is just a phonics-based teaching approach, when it is so much greater than that. But in this piece of work that you've shared with me, there are 3 key things that I really want to bring out that I believe are so powerful. And you've said that effective beginning reading teachers and intervention specialists possess 3 competencies that enable them to answer 2 questions about their practice. And those 2 questions are, what are you doing and why are you doing it? And then you go on to talk about those 3 competencies. And in my head, the way I think I literally can see this being designed, Bill, as a pretty phenomenal graphic with those, you know, what are those cognitive capacities to become a reader? And I think as teachers and intervention specialists, we have to know those inside and out. And that's where your work and the work of your colleagues really helps to bridge those research findings and that science to classroom practice, you know. And then so I've got cognitive capacities, and then as teachers and intervention specialists, we need to ask ourselves, what do our readers know? And what skills do they need to know? So we need to be sure that, you know, what I'm saying is we can actually take this simple view of reading, this foundation framework that you and your colleagues have developed, and execute that incredibly well in our skills to inform teaching and learning. And my third part is that I've taken away from my summarizing of yours was the importance of targeted evidence-based instruction. So I very much picked up through reading this piece of work around the cognitive foundations framework, the strong impetus that must be placed on individualized instruction where that's needed, and that we're not just, you know, that we must continue to differentiate in our practice and not just go holus bolus into a phonics-based approach that is, I'm going to just say whole class, or, you know, kind of en masse with one target focus. So I just wanted to share that with you, that they were at a very sort of high level, 1 or 2 of my really key takeaways from having read that incredible piece of work.
Well, thank you very much for your very kind remarks. And I would say that you have an electronic copy, don't you, of that?
Yes, I do.
I'm happy for that to be distributed to your organization. I give them, and anybody, or they can email me directly and I send them, but if they have your linkage. And I guess I just mentioned that there were, in addition to what you're saying about, well, this is just what kind of gave rise to the development of that, there are just two things. One, we were aware, of course, and you would be too, that the work of the National Reading Panel, I think in the US, that came up with the so-called Big Five. See if I can do it: phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. So that was great. And they summarized a lot of research, but when we were looking at that, we didn't see any the interrelationship between those things, those factors weren't specified. And that was one of the things we wanted to do, is to specify both how they interrelate in terms of both cognitive development and instruction. We saw that as something that was needed, and it relates to what you said a moment ago. You want a conceptual framework of what essentially the child is facing as they learn to read it in orthography. It's linked to an assessment framework that then is linked to evidence-based instruction. And the other, some instructional strategy dealing. So the idea of the cognitive foundation framework, in a sense, is to provide a roadmap, in a sense, for teachers and intervention specialists who could then see what the child knows and what they still need to know. So pinpoint exactly where they are in terms of those underlying cognitive capacities, and also where some children might be struggling. You know, just a way of trying to pin down what might be causing reading difficulty. So in that sense, that's why the article is titled both focusing on preventing reading problems and also dealing with them. So intervention. So, and just an add to that, we were kindly supported by the Ministry of Education in looking at an alternative approach. And I guess this was in 2015. Many of the people we talked about earlier were involved in that research. And this model was used to help teachers think about these, and in our staff work, and largely done, I should say, by Allison Arrow and Christine Braid. Allison Arrow is an associate professor at Canterbury now, and Dr. Christine Braid still at Massey University, and then James Chapman was involved in the latter phases of that too. And it was Keith Graney. I don't want to leave out names, but anyway, the model was tried out, and teachers from, I wasn't directly involved, but those that ran the staff development exercise say much what you have said, that they found it very helpful in what they're doing. And so I can't tell you how pleased I am that has been helpful, because that, you can do the research and find out this and that about how children learn to read, but if you develop something that can actually be of use to practitioners, that's always very gratifying. I'm pleased.
And how do you see, sorry, Matt, the internet's a wee bit glitchy, so I'm probably talking over the top of you. Sorry, Bill. How do you see that this piece of work then has the capacity to influence literacy education at national and potentially international level?
Well, certainly.
What do you hope for? What do you hope for as a result of that? It might be a better way to frame it.
Well, we have been receiving requests from all English-speaking countries for interest in the model, the article that summarizes it, the one that you read. But we've also, as I mentioned, published a book on the model that goes into all these things in more detail. It would be nice if the book perhaps were used in, it's probably more of a graduate level text though, but it's about applying the model and talking about reading and reading acquisition. That would be very good. But one of the things that I hope comes out of it, and this is kind of goes back to, a question I often wondered, why does the pendulum swing back and forth between phonics and anti-phonics? What I just say briefly is that there's two things that we mentioned in the paper, is that phonics, I think a key point, phonics itself should be seen as a means to an end, not an end in itself. So
Absolutely.
in that, children, they acquire some basic letter sound correspondences through phonics instruction, which they can use to then sort of kickstart the process of inducing more complex spelling sound patterns, then enable them to have enough knowledge to get approximations to the spoken word, which they can sometimes then identify, and then perhaps use context to identify. And after a few goes at it, they can then develop the word-specific linkages, technically called sublexical connections between the individual spoken word and the corresponding printed word, to develop what Elena Airy would describe as sight word reading. You just recognize the word almost as a sight word, but the only way to get there is through making use of the letter sound connections. That you can't, there's no evidence you can do it the way I was initially taught to read, to try to recognize words as whole word visual patterns like Chinese logographs. In fact, we know that it takes about, from a leave I had in Japan, they teach children there well, it's a complex orthographic system, the Japanese system, but one of the components is to learn to recognize about 1,000 Chinese logographs, borrowed, of course, in their orthography. That takes about 10 to 12 years of dedicated study through their whole curriculum, whereas the average high school reader of an alphabetic orthography can recognize quickly and accurately about 25,000 words by the time they graduate from high school. So there's a huge difference. It has to happen. And that's the main thing that I'd like to see, that's recognized. Another thing in terms of that pendulum going back and forth, which is certainly something that Gail Gillen and her colleagues at Canterbury have focused a lot on, and that's phonemic awareness. In order to do that, that's a critical thing. And another kind of accident of research history is that when there was a lot of work being done on speech perception by a person named Al Lieberman, a member of the National Academy of Sciences in the US, and he worked at Haskins Laboratory. That's when they found out that there's no one-to-one correspondence between something in the acoustic signal and the phonemes that we identify in words. It's more complex than that. Information for identifying one phoneme overlaps with another, technically called parallel transmission of phonemic content. But the long and short of this is that many children have experienced hearing the sounds, the phonemes in words, because they're abstract, and need some help to even benefit from phonics. So for example, they pointed out that many children might be confronted with a word like big or bag, where the first phoneme is the same, and they might go big or ba'aga or ba'iga, where you're really talking about 5 phonemes, because you can't say the phoneme, it's the first phoneme in those 2 words in isolation as it happens. You need some information downstream from that. And so that's why it's so complex. In fact, a lot of children who don't have that ability to see what we're getting at when we say ba is the first phoneme, which they have of the segment ba, they have to be able to segment that, which is a more abstract linguistic version. And that is so critical. And I think that's why over the years there's been this pendulum swinging back and forth between phonics instruction and something else, because there were some children who weren't benefiting from phonics. And I would submit that it's because they were struggling with phonemic awareness, which is necessary to benefit. And so that's another thing I think in the model we strongly emphasize. And there's people like Gail Gillen and her colleagues and others who've done tremendous work. And Isabel Lieberman, who happened to be the partner, the wife of Al Lieberman in the 70s, she was an educational psychologist who worked with children with reading problems. She thought, well, I'll develop a phonemic awareness test. And that's precisely what she found in the early 70s, which became another thing that the scientific community was focusing on, the role of phonemic awareness, which is nothing to do with, well, it's important, but it in and of itself is not it's not print itself. It's just a precondition for making those connections. So that's another aspect that I hope is picked up, that's emphasized in the model, that's picked up.
Yes.
And the only final point I'd make is that there's huge individual differences in how much phonics instruction the children need. Some children need a lot, some need less. And that's why the framework, we think, can be useful in what we would describe as differentiated instruction, where sometimes, individuals vary, but they have to have it. And so some children, maybe because of the home literacy environment or things that they required prior to entering school, even might give them an edge on understanding the alphabetic principle. They might have played with letters on the fridge, made up words. I know my son liked making up words with letters like KLR for color or FRE. And that was even before he arrived at school. And I'll just share this anecdote. I showed Marie Clay what he was doing once, a long time ago. And she said, he'll be an independent reader in 6 months. And she was right. I'll give her credit for that. She was correct in looking at his preschool invented spellings. And of course, that's why she has incorporated a kind of, which is odd given the other things in that model, but she did observe that some children had difficulties hearing the sounds of words. So the Russian psychologist Elkonin had done work on that, and she brought that into the model. But my only concern there is that ought to be looked at the beginning of school and not wait a year to start.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow, that is, yeah, that I've just been jotting down notes, and one of the things that I was jotting down when you were speaking earlier was, we have to teach both word recognition and language comprehension. That's a no-brainer, pardon the pun, but some may need more in the word recognition skill side of things, just like some may need more also in the language comprehension. We don't know what they're coming in with in terms of those skills. But if we just sit in that word recognition piece for a moment to summarize what you've said, phonemic awareness on school entry is crucial. We need to absolutely know, so we need to be able to identify. Earlier we talked about what you were talking about in that framework is that teachers need to know what's important to teach, and then they need to know who they're teaching it to varying degrees, just to put that in very simplistic terms, Bill. So first and foremost, them focusing on phonemic awareness and understanding that is the glue that holds the phonics and helps for us to be able to move that forward is incredibly important. When it comes to the mapping of sound to symbol and symbol to sound associations through decoding and encoding, we know that some children will take many more repetitions than others to orthographically map those symbols in isolation before they even go to word level, to sentence level, to text level. So some really, really valid points. And I just want to throw in too, and I know you've got this in this foundations framework, you talk about the impact of verbal working memory. When you were giving your example of big versus bag and that phoneme manipulation going on in the middle, not only do I have to have that phonemic awareness intact, but I really need a teacher who knows, understands, and can support me in my processing ability to be able to hold those sounds and then be able to do something with them and to detect, is it the fact I can't hold the sound, or actually don't I have the skill of phoneme manipulation? So it's a complex beast, isn't it? It really is.
And fast accurate, which you mentioned earlier, the orthographic mapping, they're becoming, sort of what Aries described as sight word learning. Getting to that point is so critical, because if children are laboriously sounding out every word or trying to use context to figure out what the word is, they're going to tax their ability to derive meaning from the sentence, because the words that they first identified will probably be forgotten by the time they get to the end. So
absolutely,
if children don't learn to read that way, then their word recognition ability will be very slow, and they won't be able to progress very well in terms of reading comprehension. It has to be fast and accurate. But the working memory works in two ways, that way too.
Yeah. So Bill, what is one final message that you would like to give to, I'm going to say the classroom teachers of New Zealand and probably internationally, there will be some who are watching this as well, but you know, what is one thing that you wish for classroom teachers to really fundamentally understand about literacy acquisition? I'm going to say reading acquisition. There's one succinct sort of message that you could close with. There's been lots of gold in here, and I think people are going to want to go back and watch this over and over to hear all these great messages. And I will send or will post up this Cognitive Foundations Framework article. It's absolutely brilliant. What is one last message that you'd like to share with them?
I guess it's a sort of reiteration of the simple view that was put forward many years ago, that the recognition that there are two key components that account for individual differences in reading comprehension performance, and that are causally related. Some of the research over the years has tried to say, well, there's others, or there's this, or there's that, and there's some technical issues that have been resolved, but that model, I'm pleased to say, has held up for 35 years. In fact, there was a special issue. The original model was published in Remedial and Special Education, and just a couple of years ago, there was a special issue of that same journal after that long time. It was guest edited by Sharon Vaughn. It was focusing on all the issues with commentary about the simple view, and I'm pleased to say that the studies show that it has held up. Certain things are attended to, some technical issues regarding measurement issues mostly. But I would think maybe using it, and also, I guess another broader thing, just as we know that science is important to listen to in respect of things like pandemics and global warming and so forth. This seems to be a hot and button issue, but science is important.
Absolutely.
Consider how
and the evolution of education
and learning and this and that. So listen to the science, I guess, would be a very broad question. Don't get fixed on a particular approach and make it a belief thing. But I mean, some of the components of the model that we put forward, maybe 10 years from now, this is something different will pop up in there. You just have to be prepared to make adjustments to what you do in terms of the science.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Bill. There have been so many incredible takeaways that I know people who are really interested and have a vested interest in supporting their own children to become readers, supporting the children that they teach, or the students that they have under their care and watch as a school leader. I really, really honestly want to thank you on behalf of all of the classroom teachers, school leaders and parents across our country for your incredible dedication to reading education over such an extensive period. We're very, very grateful for what you've brought to New Zealand shores, and I really am very genuine and honest when I share that thanks with you. I know that I speak on behalf so many people, because your work helps us to bridge the gap and to dispel the myths that have been floating around on these shores of New Zealand for far too long. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, everybody, and we'll look forward to our next chit chat with you next month.